Welcome to those of you who are here. So my name is Paul Allen Sommerfeld, and this is my colleague Susan Claremont, and we are music specialists in the music division, one of our projects we've been working on for, at least I've been working on a couple of years, and Susan's been working on for many more years than that, is with our early or pre-1800 musical manuscripts and imprints and getting them cataloged and getting them reported to a larger database that we're going to talk about today so that people know that we have them and can use them for their various research and work. So we're going to walk through some of the amazing things that we have found over the last few years and why we're doing all of this work. So I'm going to hand it over to Susan to start us off.
About 2 years ago, the Music Division reestablished an official partnership with RISM, an international association of top music scholars, musicologists, and librarians who for the past 70 years have been pursuing a singular goal: to document what music resources exist worldwide and to determine where they are located. The acronym RISM stands for Répertoire International des Sources Musicales, or an International Inventory of Musical Sources. The goals of RISM are not only ambitious, but unparalleled, perhaps in any discipline. Go to the next. A little bit of the RISM history. The need to initiate such an impossible project, really, of identifying all pre-1800 manuscripts and imprints in the world and recording who holds them, first came up after the First World War, but it reemerged with much more urgency after the Second World War, when sources were particularly vulnerable. Plans began in earnest to create an inventory around 1949. By 1952, the committee there were committee meetings comprised of musicologists and librarians that were held in Paris, and by the following year, the RISM organization was established. By 1960, the first publications appeared, Series B, which are anthologies of music. In 1971, the largest undertaking by RISM started, comprising of 13 volumes that list all pre-1800 editions of music published by a single composer. In 1978, the A2 series started, which was composers' manuscripts or copyist manuscripts as well. Because of the inherent issues and fluidity with manuscript material, this project was not destined to appear in a book format, but rather it appeared on microfiche that was easily updated, and then it came out as a CD-ROM with annual updates. In 1997, Series A2, the manuscripts, appeared as an internet database offered in 2008 by subscription through EBSCO, and then it was free of charge in 2010 through the RISM offices. In 2013, RISM data was offered as open data, in 2014 as linked open data, and at this point, Series A1, A2, and Series B are being all merged into one single database that is available online for free, no subscription needed. So everyone has access, and they use it. 2015 also saw advances in online reporting for individual libraries, and this is where we realized that we needed to up our game and step in and start doing some reporting. By 2018, Paul and I, every week we sit down and we are actively reporting things that have not shown up in the RISM database. RISM, yeah, we can keep that. Right now, RISM lists a little over 1 million music manuscripts, close to 200,000 imprints, and it represents 38,000 composers. And that is growing every day, every year. There was a precedent for RISM. It's not like the first time that this idea came to light. Robert Eitner was a bibliographer and musician, composer, whatever. He published a 10-volume set called the Kellen Lexicon. It was epic. He published it in 1900, and it only covered European libraries, about 200 European libraries, but it was along the same lines of what's there and how do we find it, who holds different things. And so Eitner sort of served as the model and the philosophical backbone of the modern RISM project. But it did only cover European libraries. I want to point out a few things where RISM intersects really with the Library of Congress. At its inception in the 1950s, many of the members on the RISM committee envisioned their new musical inventory to closely follow Eitner's model, like I said, and only include European libraries. But it's a credit to the Library of Congress that we helped to convince that committee that it was crucial at this point in time in the mid-20th century to include all libraries worldwide, not just European libraries, and for the United States to become a major player. The Library of Congress was successful in claiming a spot as one of the 6 premier national libraries to lead the RISM project. We had a reference librarian. His name was Richard S. Hill. He was the sole U.S. delegate to participate in the 1952 Paris meetings when RISM was established. He also served on the Joint U.S. Committee. After his death, our chief, Harold Spivak, filled in for him and conducted his duties. In 1965, our library took over responsibilities for the solicitation, processing, and reporting of all U.S. RISM entries. We were it. In 1985, however, the U.S. RISM office was relocated to Harvard University, and only sporadic reporting of Library of Congress resources then continued as new RISM publications were being prepared. Beginning in 2008, staff research focusing on our early music sources revealed that a very large percentage of our holdings were still absent from both the Library of Congress online catalog as well as in RISM sources. Documentation of these shortcomings and strategies for correcting them ensued. The urgency to report these omissions became more critical once RISM established this subscription-free online database, because people could see, they could look online and say, I wonder who has this particular item, and if we're not there, and we weren't being consulted for our own materials. So that's why in 2018, Paul and I decided we would start correcting this omission. Currently, the Library of Congress has reported 19,000 items. 14,000 are imprints, about 5,000 are manuscripts. Many of these were picked up because RISM, if you have a digital copy of something on your website, they pick up on that and make a record for it. So close to 4,000 of our digital items have been linked to RISM. Probably the most reported items are operas, close to 3,000. And the most underreported items include chamber music, sacred music, and all genres of manuscript materials. You can compare us with libraries in Germany. The library in Berlin has reported 88,000 to date. Library in Munich is 78,000, British Library 74, but we're not the lowest number. I mean, there are other libraries that have reported less than we have, and I think it's all a matter of funding and getting staff to put in these reports. What's left to report? RISM estimates that today their catalog contains 33% of pre-1800 music manuscripts that are extant worldwide. And they say they have about 60% of extant pre-1800 imprints. So it is not complete by any stretch of the imagination, and hopefully we will help to remedy some of that with our work. I have a little aside. This is Richard S. Hill. He was the member of the music reference staff who served on the first RISM committee. He was really one of the prominent members of that committee. We have lots of correspondence from the 1940s and 1950s in his collection that chronicles all of the work that he did on behalf of RISM and on behalf of the United States, really, to get this project off the ground. This is an example of one of the letters from Friedrich Bloom, who was the RISM Joint Committee Chair, writing to the Librarian of Congress, Luther Evans, saying that he wants the Library of Congress to take that role as one of 6 national libraries worldwide to take the lead. And this is one of Richard Hill's letters. He sent letters to hundreds and hundreds of libraries across and institutions across the United States asking to please send in their information so that he could do the reporting to RISM. Mr. Eitner. Yes, we mentioned Robert Eitner as having done the Kellen lexicon. He was also a composer. And in the process of researching Mr. Eitner a little bit, we found that we have the only holograph manuscript of Mr. Eitner's musical work. It's an oratorio named, the title is Judith, and we have just recently reported Judith to RISM. There are 26, I think, other entries for Robert Eitner. They're all German libraries. And then there's the one library in the United States with the holograph manuscript, which is ours. So, okay. Let me turn this over to Paul.
So now we're going to talk about and share some of the many things that we have found in our reporting that are interesting for a variety of reasons. So first, we're going to talk about Willoughby Bertie, Earl of Abingdon, a composer from the late 18th century. So back in January of 2019, Susan and I sat down to report our first batch of items to RISM on a very cold day. We'd selected and polled about a dozen items, thinking that we could breeze through them in about 2 hours. Famous last words. From the card catalog, Susan had found a couple of pieces by Willoughby Bertie, Earl of Abingdon, and when we finally looked at the physical items at this meeting, it quickly became clear that this bound volume that we had, this one bound volume, had more than 1 or 2 pieces within it, as we thought it did. Suffice to say, we spent our entire 2-hour meeting reporting over a dozen items from that one bound volume alone, including a handful that weren't in RISM at all, meaning that they are potentially unique to the library's collections. Our catalog records didn't mention them either, meaning they were, for all intents and purposes, hidden from any kind of user discovery. So in this, you can see it's bound with all of these other items. There are capriccios, minuets, country dances, songs, hymns, marches, and some of my favorite are some more patriotic items. There's the Convention March, where it says Washington bed up for the 8th for the Constitution. The American Militia, the March of the 13 Stripes. Oh, go back up. But all of these different kinds of pieces that we hadn't really encountered before, and even if they did have a RISM record, there are only 1 or 2 institutions typically that report having these items, and we're often the only non-European library for many of them. And it's unique items like these are how we know that we will continue to find rare and valuable imprints for years to come, because there are a lot of bound volumes like this in our collections. This is another example. This is a copyist manuscript by the composer Isabella Colbran that is bound with several other works by others. And it's, again, we don't really know what's in the volume until we actually look at it, because a catalog record in the cards might have 1 piece written, but there could be easily a dozen more, as we found out on our very first day of reporting. So another really interesting item that we found is by the composer Ludovico Grossi da Viadana, who was an Italian composer, teacher, and Franciscan friar who lived from about 1560 to 1627. He was one of the earliest composers to make use of figured bass, which would come to define much of the Baroque era. And the music division holds in its collection several imprints from the early 1600s that have proved particularly tricky to report. So how did this happen? So part of our process as we report to RISM is that we go through the physical card catalog, card by card, alphabetically, seeing if there are items that need to be reported. So it can be very labor intensive checking the print bound volumes of RISM, but then also checking the database. So I was waking my way through the letter V, because I started at the end of the alphabet and Susan started at the beginning, so that we wouldn't be constantly using the same drawers and volumes and information. So while going through the letter V, I found an item and a record for an early 17th century piece by Viadana. When I went to check the database to see if it had been reported, I discovered something odd. The library had been reported decades ago as having just the quintus, or voice 5, of a 1607 edition of this piece, the Psalmni Omnes, one of 3 institutions in the world. But something was odd when I looked at the card. The card indicated it was the second of 2 cards for an item record, and the first card was nowhere to be found. So I requested the item to be pulled, and in the meantime did some investigating. First, I checked our card catalogs, our other card catalogs, the title series. We have a series in the cataloging section that duplicates what we have, and then there's the shelf list that just goes through what's literally on the shelf in order. All of those were also missing the first card. And I needed that card to figure out what was going on, that this was so weird. Luckily, the reading room still keeps a microfiche, and you can see a scan of it on the slide here, of the shelf, the microfiche of the shelf list that was made back in the 1950s. So what you see on the slide is card 2 of the card, and then next to it is a scan of the microfiche, not even microfilm, a microfiche that was made in the 1950s. Luckily, I was able to check that, and the first card was still there when they scanned it in the 50s, and that proved incredibly illuminating to figure out what had happened. It became clear to me that one of my previous colleagues had, decades ago, looked only at this card and not the physical item to report our holdings for this particular Viadana print. Hence, why they reported the library as having V1369. You can see with RISM the way that they give a number to everything, so there'll be the letter for whatever letter of the alphabet it is, and then a number, and then it's just sequential. They had reported us as having V1369, which is at the top of the slide, and a part of V1370. But what I discovered was that we actually had V1370, 71, and 72. And that if they had looked at the item and the full record of the card, they would have figured out what we actually had. And why that's so rare and so interesting is we are only one of 2 libraries in the world that has a full set of parts for this particular piece. The other library is in Bologna. So you can see that's the BC, that's their sigla. Their BC is the designation for their library. And we're the only ones that have a full set of parts. And before, everybody thought we just had 2 parts from a set of 5. So it's, again, an incredibly rare item, made even more rarer, that we discovered simply by reporting and having to check various print, microfilmed, and online sources to discover that. So, and you'll see the item is on the table, but these are some scans from the item itself. It's a really lovely print. So similarly, there are composers from the late 18th century for whom we have significant holdings of their works that have been grossly underreported to RISM. One of those is Johann Baptist von Hall. The mention of late 18th century Vienna frequently conjures thoughts of Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven. But a Bohemian composer, violinist, and teacher, von Hall remained active in Austria throughout his life. He moved to Vienna in the early 1760s. And he became a very prominent composer in Viennese circles at that time. He was very prominent in the burgeoning Viennese publishing industry. In the years that followed after his move to Vienna, Viennese publishers issued over 270 prints of his music, and foreign publishers such as Andre the Hummels, John Bland, and Robert Bremer helped spread his music's reach, providing a model for the composers who followed him in the 19th century. So he was really at the forefront of music publishing right before it exploded in Europe at that time. And as we discovered, we have a lot of imprints for him, especially his chamber music. About how, beginning in the 1780s, he realized that the market for large symphonic works maybe wasn't what it once was. And so he started composing, and publishing a lot of chamber music. And so we have lots and lots of songs, very strophic often, that of various topics that he published and were wildly popular with middle-class audiences in Vienna and throughout Europe at that time. Again, none of it reported. So these are on the table as well to see after we're done talking. Similarly, Johann Rudolf Zumsteeg spent most of his career in what is now southern Germany around the city of Stuttgart. He was the concertmaster at the Württemberg court, and he championed works of other German composers, or Germanish composers, especially Mozart's operas Don Giovanni, The Magic Flute, Così fan tutte. But he was also a composer in his own right and wrote a great number of ballads and lieder, writing especially lyric melodies and experimentations with harmony that were very influential on Schubert in the coming decades. And again, not reported. We've now reported several dozen pieces of these chamber or small ensemble works that nobody knew we had. Several of them are possibly unique to the library because we still have to create new RISM records for them. So it's, again, staggering, the number of pieces. And I have this one up here. This one is one of my favorites. It's called Die Bösende. And really it's my favorite because this lovely engraving on the cover, I'll do a close-up of that. We have this woman playing her lute, looking rather unamused, or maybe even rolling her eyes, with a skeleton in the closet next door, and then as two gentlemen walk in. And it's in such great condition, probably because very few people knew that it existed here. But when you start to read the text, the engraving starts to make a bit more sense. It deals with essentially a woman learning to be penitent and learning her place, because Die Bösende translates as depenitent as well. But it starts to make sense why this particular engraving might be on there on the cover.
What's the stamp there?
So that's part of when it was acquired by the library. So one final composer, there's a cover of the first page of music. But one final composer, as I'm going to hand it over to Susan again, is Peter von Winter, who was a composer who sort of bridged the gap into the 19th century. He composed a lot of operas, and indeed he was primarily an opera composer who has significant coverage in our collections. And there are many of his opera scores that we could discuss, but I'm going to hand this over to Susan to talk about one particularly special item that was reported recently, especially because it was reported through her efforts.
And let me digress just for a minute to tell you a little bit about the provenance of this one manuscript that we have out here that's by Peter von Winter. In 1902, a new set of guidelines for the systematic development of the newly organized music division's collections was instituted, and opera immediately received a considerable share of attention because, quote, the peculiar condition of opera in the United States seemed to demand that a center of reference and research be created for the students of opera. And that's a quote from Oscar Sonic in 1908. Accordingly, a series of want lists were compiled. However, when it was determined, after a comprehensive search, that hundreds of items included on the music division's want lists for operas in full score were unprocurable in manuscript or print version, the option of contracting copyists to generate transcripts was explored. Efforts to identify the locations of cities and libraries that held exact version of these scores was made, and then to negotiate copying permissions, costs, terms. They were all initially led by the music division chief, Oscar Sonic, starting in 1903. And he had the full support of the Librarian of Congress, who was an opera buff, Herbert Putnam. The project went for 25 years, and about 700 transcriptions were completed. Most libraries were cooperative, except those in Italy. They would not let us come in and copy their materials. One such transcript that was made back in 1922, when the project was drawing to a completion, was Cora and Alonso by Peter von Winter. You can scroll down here. There it is. And you can see there were certain criteria, if you look at the slide. Mr. Sonic wrote up all of what needed to be done for each copyist that was doing the work. He wanted it as close to a facsimile as possible, and at the very end, the copyist was required to date this copy and sign their name to it and say which library or which institution they copied the manuscript from. So this is an example, Cora and Alonso. A little bit back to Peter von Winter, as Paul was saying. He's a German opera composer. He followed Mozart and preceded Carl Maria von Weber, so acting as a bridge between the two in the development of German opera. Winter was born at Mannheim, and he played in the Mannheim Court Orchestra. He was a violinist. He also studied with Salieri in Vienna. And in 1778, he moved to Munich, where he became the director of the Court Theater, at which point he started to write stage works, and at first ballets and then melodramas. And Cora and Alonso is one of these. It did get its premiere in 1778 in Munich. The thing with this particular opera is that the original that we copied from was really the only copy of Cora and Alonso. And during the Second World War, it was lost. So our transcript is the only copy of Cora and Alonso at this point. There are other examples that part of this transcript project that the original items that we copied back 100 years ago are missing, and we hold the only copy. So we thought it was particularly important to report as many of these transcripts. They don't quite fit the criteria in some way. I mean, RISM is supposed to be pre-1800, and obviously this transcript came from 1922, but the opera itself was from 1778, so it does fit the bill. And several of these were reported, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, there was a spreadsheet that was sent to RISM saying, here are all of these transcripts. They haven't all shown up online yet. Paul and I are going to have to review which ones did get reported, which ones did not get reported. There's a lot of sorting to do with this, but these really need to go up there because they sometimes hold far more importance than we anticipate. Other copyist manuscripts are much better known here at the library. That's the record for Peter von Winter. And you can see we've reported Cora and Alonso. And you see at the very bottom, the only library that's listed as holding is the Library of Congress. So that one has gone up. We did put that record in. Okay. Another very underreported category that's dear to my heart are music tablatures. Carl Engel was our second music division chief, and he had a particular interest in notation, whether it was notations for chants or tablatures for lute, for organ, for whatever instrument. And he did a lot of collecting of these particular materials. Somehow, when RISM reporting was being done in the early days for the library, these particular classification numbers around the M126 and M140 for tablatures was ignored, and no one knew we had them. A lot of catalog records did not make it online either, so they were hidden. Efforts now have been made to create or update our online catalog records, and to insert several of these extremely rare volumes into our digital queue. So soon they should be going up online. We've also succeeded in having several individual scans included in the upcoming publication, An Encyclopedia of Tablature, which is being compiled under the editorship of John Griffiths, David Delata, and Philip Ventrix as part of Project Richard at the Centre d'études supérieures de la Renaissance in Tours. It will comprise 400 examples of tablature for some 40 instruments with facsimiles, transcriptions, and commentaries, and the Library of Congress will be included in that encyclopedia. One of the most outstanding, I think, examples of our tablatures is a volume, it's my favorite volume in the whole collection, the Capricci a due strumenti by Bellerofonte Castaldi. Castaldi was a lute virtuoso, composer, poet, an artist, and a radical. He was like the Bob Dylan or the Leonard Cohen of his day. He was a rock god, and he knew it. His duos from his Capricci a due strumenti are for Tiorbo and Tiorbino, which is a smaller version of the Tiorbo. And Castaldi actually invented the Tiorbino so that he could do his duo. So he has his own instrument there. They're showpieces, and he also did all of the engraving for this volume. He had a friend who had an engraving shop and asked if he could step in, so he engraved the volume. He decorated it with his own artwork. This volume came to us as a gift from Suzanne Bloch, the daughter of Ernest Bloch, composer Ernest Bloch. She was an early music performer, and she gave this to the library in the early 1980s. And for some reason, because the card catalog had already closed, there was no card for it in the catalog. It didn't make it into the online catalog, and it certainly wasn't reported to RISM. No one knew we had Castaldi. There were several researchers. One did an entire dissertation on this particular volume of lute pieces and searched the world for this copy and couldn't find it. He only wrote about the copy in France and the copy in Modena, where Castaldi was from. Now he knows we have it. He's coming back. He's going to do a paper about our Castaldi book. Castaldi is he's a very colorful character. He has a big preface at the beginning of this book where he talks about his life and how it's a tragic life, it's a dramatic life. His younger brother was killed. The older brother was expected to avenge the death. He bought a gun. He shot himself in the foot. He was lame. He couldn't get any women. He had to drink alcohol because of the pain. I mean, it's just a great preface. He's very, very colorful, but the music it's wonderful music. It's been recorded and it's been written about in the literature now. But one of my favorites.
What is the Tiorobino? Is it X out today? Is that one thing?
I believe so, yeah, because they've recorded these pieces.
Is it from the lute or a smaller lute?
It's a smaller Tiorbo.
There.
It's an octave higher, I believe. Mhm. I have two other examples. I'm not going to get into details with these, but again, this Barbetta is one of 3 copies in the world. We're the only US library. The other 2 are European libraries. As listed here, one in Germany, one in Poland. And there's a third example of tablature. We do have some tablatures that are in manuscript, quite a few of them. This one is particularly wonderful. It's about this is organ tablature. It was done around the 1590s. I think the final date on this is 1602. And it's about 100 pieces of this person, Erasmus Hoffer's, favorite motets from the 16th century. And he entabulated them, and he has them all in the book. And about 25% of them are unica. The pieces don't exist anywhere else. And we have this particular book of tablature. It's been studied, it's been written about, it's important. It's not in RISM yet, but we will get to the letter H soon enough. Another category are sacred music. Let's skip ahead to one. Yeah. Our sacred music volumes are very much underreported. Anything in those M2000s, it's hit or miss. And Paul and I realize we have a lot of work to do there. We have one. This one is it's a print edition of hymns, Marian hymns, that were published in 1647 in Czechoslovakia. The composer's name is Adam Michna, is how he's usually referred to. He was a Czech composer, poet, hymn writer, organist, and choir leader of the early Baroque era, who studied at the town's Jesuit gymnasium. The Jesuits were the leading musical force in the Czech lands in the 17th and 18th centuries, and Michna seems to have become one of their favorite composers. Besides his musical creds, Michna was also a tavern keeper, and his compositions are filled with popular and vernacular allusions as well. The hymns are clearly influenced by a strong and long-established tradition of congregational singing in Czech lands, but nothing discoverable in his background fully accounts for the marked and contemporary Italian influence in his Latin church music. We have one hymnal by Michna, and it is part of our collections and will be reported in 2020. It contains simple 4- and 5-part homophonic settings of his own religious poetry, and several of the pieces from this book have remained in popular use in Czechoslovakia to this day. And we have not reported Michna yet. You see, it's only available in 2 Czech libraries worldwide. That's it.
Haven't gotten to him yet.
We haven't made Adam yet, no. Okay. Another example of sacred pieces, and this is a big category. This is a book, it's called the Ephrata Codex. It technically really wasn't the first hymnal of the Ephrata cloisters, but it's close. The Ephrata cloister flourished in the first half of the 18th century in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, under the leadership of Johann Conrad Beissel. Much like a medieval monastery, singing was an integral part of their monastic life. Beissel taught music theory and practice of music and oversaw all the brothers and sisters who produced beautifully decorated books that preserve their musical canon. Today, the Library of Congress is one of only 3 institutions that preserve the music of the Ephrata cloister. Our collection includes about 15 books, most of them in manuscript. They span about 1739 to 1780. And this particular one, the one that we call the Ephrata Codex, has an inscription in it. We believe that this one at one point belonged to Benjamin Franklin. There's one example of the music from it. Lancaster, yes. Mhm. Okay. And I'm out of order here, I am sorry. Clementi, yeah. I might as well just read from that. 91 musical imprints by Clementi are reported in RISM under the LC Sigla. However, we have well over 60 holograph manuscripts by Clementi in our collections, and none of them have been reported. Some of them haven't even been identified. Many are now in our online catalog, but there's a lot of work, and I'm anticipating that Paul and I will spend many 2-hour RISM sessions just trying to figure out how to report these. Usually for manuscript material, you're asked to put in the incipits, which we've learned how to do, and so it's much easier to figure out if other libraries are holding similar manuscripts, because we do have that ability to check the incipits and to enter our own in. But Clementi is soon to come. We're on the letter C. So. Okay. Oh, the Bach. The Bach, yeah, one of I think I had mentioned the Bach before. One of the better known manuscripts that we have here in the library it's a collection of the French suites by Johann Sebastian Bach. At first, when we got the manuscript in 1924, it was billed as being, it was a gift, and they said this was one of the originals. It was in Bach's hand, but it is not. It is in the hand of Johann Christoph Altnickel. But that being said, it's not any less important. There are only 6 complete manuscripts of the Bach French suites. There is not a complete holograph of the Bach French suites. And all 6 of the copyist manuscripts, this one in particular, because it's a student who Bach knew and had in his home, he probably copied this particular example from a manuscript that was in Bach's home. So it's got a lot of significance to it in the ordering of it. It's an earlier manuscript, so there are differences in the musical content on this one. We all know it here, we know it well. It's not yet reported in RISM, but we are about to do that as well. So.
So continuing with manuscripts that we've been reporting. For many performing ensembles, every year seems to be a Beethoven year, but the year 2020 has become particularly star-studded, celebrating the composer's 250th anniversary. With this context in mind, Susan and I decided at the beginning of this year to tackle the library's lack of reporting our significant Beethoven holdings to RISM. We had discovered that none of our manuscripts or imprints had been reported. None. Now, it does make sense why this would be so. As primarily a composer of the early 19th century, most of Beethoven's works fall outside the previously hard cutoff date of 1800 for RISM reporting. It used to be a very hard pre-1800, anything post-1800 was outside the domain of RISM. But with RISM's migration to the online database over the last several years, many major institutions have begun reporting their Beethoven holdings. We didn't want to be left behind either. The music division holds over a dozen music manuscripts and sketches in Beethoven's hand, and as of this past Thursday, almost all of them have been reported. We have 2 more to finish. Again, this work is vital, as many researchers and performers alike use the database as their primary means to locate any imprints or any manuscripts worldwide. So these manuscripts that we have include the complete manuscript for the Opus 109 Piano Sonata, the 6th movement of Opus 3 Trio, sketches from the Presto of the Opus 130 String Quartet, sketches for his famous Opus 106 Hammerklavier Piano Sonata. The list goes on. But sketches for this last work are of special importance, the Hammerklavier Sonata, because no complete manuscript in his hand exists for the work, and we have 8 pages of sketches for the 3rd and 4th movements, and there are only a handful of institutions that have sketches for those particular movements. And so a much larger ongoing project is now to report the over 400 first and early editions, early imprints of his works, demonstrating our work is quite never done. Because with these Beethoven imprints, there are a lot of institutions reporting what they have now, and we have one of the largest collections of those first and early editions, and so now we're determining what do we have specifically and then to report it. So these are just some scans of some of the items, and we do have them on display as well to see after we're finished speaking. So then that leaves us at the end here with what is the future for our RISM reporting? Well, Susan and I have continued to go through the cards. I'm in letter T, she's in letter C. We'll meet our way in the middle at some point. And we're now really reporting manuscripts. Our first year, we focused primarily on imprints, just to get a handle on the sheer volume of the project. But now reporting manuscripts has added a whole new dimension to continue on. And we've really got a workflow going now with many, many more items to report. We've mentioned like the bound with volumes, like the Abingdon. We have over 300 binders volumes from the 19th century that have many works in them that easily fall under RISM's original parameters of pre-1800. And maybe even one day RISM will make its way into the 19th century with reporting, as so many other European institutions are already doing. So it's, again, our work is never done, that this really isn't a project that we will complete, but a workflow that will become embedded in the library's practices. So I think now what we'll do is, if you want to come forward, we have a lot of these materials on display, so you can take a look at them. We can talk more specifics about several of them, and actually just get a feel and look for, well, not a feel, a look for the actual items. So come on up.